Okay, we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Vision Critical webinar, where we're going to be talking about how to not fall behind in 2020 and how to optimize your customer experience programs to stay connected with your customers. I'm very, very thrilled today to have Faith Adams joining us from Forrester. Faith is a senior analyst at Forrester focused on the customer experience space. Faith, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
Hanging in there. Very excited to be here. I just feel like this is just such a great opportunity for teams to reset and reevaluate everything. So just thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for participating today. And just by way of quick introduction for myself, my name is Nicole Keeley. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Vision Critical. And so I'm going to wear a couple hats today. I'm going to be both your moderator and your speaker. So we have some great content lined up for you today. Just before we jump into that, I wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items. So if you have any questions during the session, there's a Q&A panel here on the Zoom interface that you can use to submit those, and we'll answer them at the end. And then for those of you who are interested in perhaps viewing the content again or sharing the recording, we will be sending that out to all the registrants within 48 hours of the event, and it'll also be on our website. So thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I hope everyone is healthy and well and sane and doing as well as possible during these crazy times. So Faith, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. So we all know that businesses have already been challenged to adapt with the ever-changing wants, needs, and demands of our customers. After all, the customer is more empowered than ever. But with this current environment that we're in today, unfortunately, that challenge and requirement to adapt has become even more critical. Digital transformation is not just a nice to have or something that companies can move at their own pace to. It's actually something now that is a must-have, and it's going to be a critical differentiator as we all continue to move forward. These current events require us to really evolve and adapt faster and really continue to meet those wants, needs, and demands of our customers. Customer experience, I always say it's very, very important to many companies. They know that it's something they need to differentiate on, but today, now, more than ever, it's even more critical. But this is also because, CX, even though it remains important, and many companies have claimed to have doubled down on CX, it doesn't always mean that companies are making the most of their investments or even seeing the intended results of their efforts. In fact, a lot of executives continue to say that CX is very important, but they're really not backing it up with their actions. And this can be seen with this data point here, because according to our Forrester CX Index, for 3 years in a row, 0% of brands have been excellent when it comes to their customer experience. And I hate to say it, but I'm a little skeptical that maybe this didn't change this year. This data is going to be coming out in upcoming weeks, and I'm hoping I'm wrong, but I'm afraid that based on what I've been seeing and this lack of willingness to adapt in a timely fashion by many organizations, this is going to remain the same. So the fact is that when we look at this data, even brands that have been known for excellent customer experiences and brands that companies aspire to be like, even they are struggling to keep up with those wants, needs, and demands of the ever-changing customer. And so this plateaued CX quality, it really stems from a few things. First off, that rise of the customer expectations that I keep talking to, and then the company's ability to actually respond. And with that, their ability to actually mature their additional CX capabilities. And so at Forrester, we talk about the 6 competencies of customer experience. And these are research, not research coming necessarily just from your VOC program, but ongoing customer research efforts. CX measurement, more of those quantitative metrics. Prioritization, having the ability to prioritize effectively to move the needle on those things that are not only going to impact that customer experience, but have those business outcomes as well. Enablement, making sure that your employees have the right tools and the processes to actually deliver that experience. Design, being able to infuse the voice of the customer and insights into the design experience to really be able to iterate and create those exceptional experiences that your customers desire. And then lastly, and I always like to say that culture is king, culture is critical. So in those organizations where you have a strong culture, sometimes it enables them to get a little bit of a pass when it comes to some of these other competencies, maybe not being as mature. But when it comes to CX, it's very important to be able to have each of these competencies. It's not just about simply listening to your customer. And each of these are also related to our next topic, which is VOC programs. Now, we all know that on any given day, including pre-COVID times, that it was really important to listen to that voice of your customer. In VOC at Forrester, we define it as a systematic approach to collecting customer feedback, mining that feedback for insights, and infusing it into business decisions. It's about completing the cycle continuously, listening to that voice of the customer, interpreting and analyzing it, learning more about the experience that you're delivering, so to speak, and then engaging your stakeholders to act. And then inspiring more of that action continuously through completing this loop, closing the customer feedback loop, prioritizing effectively, and then again, proving and monitoring, showing that impact to the business, showing that ROI, and showing what it means. But unfortunately, and this is, I know I sound like a little bit of a negative Nelly here, and I feel like I've been doing this a little too much lately. It's not all bunnies and rainbows, as I like to say. There's a lot of challenges at each of these different phases. So listening to the customer. Too many companies are survey obsessed. They're not tapping into the wealth of feedback that they have within their organization, including that voice of the employee. They also have a number of listening efforts taking place with absolutely no coordination. It's not uncommon for companies to have 5, 6, 10 plus tools in place that often do the same thing. And they're often being used in isolation of one another, not being wrangled together. Interpreting. This is often very ad hoc, or in some organizations, they'll talk about being swimming in data, but they're not able to get to insights. So it ends up being this more of the siloed view of the experiences, not really coming together. They're not always doing a great job of wrangling the data. They're not always even able to deliver the insights that are meaningful and relevant to specific stakeholders as well, because a lot of times they're not measuring things that are very specific and relevant to different stakeholders. As far as driving action, and I alluded to this before, is that there's no closed loop process, despite the fact that having a formal closed loop, whether it be that inner loop or that outer loop, a lot of organizations are still struggling, whether it be closing the loop one-on-one, closing the loop more collectively, and then making those bigger systemic changes as a result of what they're uncovering through feedback. And then lastly, not being able to show that impact and value. If there's one point that I like to drive home, it's that being able to show that ROI, that movement on the metrics that matter, that establishing that connection with the customer and that internal rewards and recognition for delivering those great experiences is so critical, but companies often get stuck there. So because of these challenges, we're seeing a lot of companies not really realizing the value of their investments in CX and VOC programs in particular. So this brings me to my next point. Companies must evolve and innovate how they're listening to their customers. We know that listening is very important. And like I said, it's just not as simple as collecting that feedback. It's about tapping into more of that insight and more of that information that you might already be collecting. Sources that already exist, for example, making the most of other tools and technologies that might be in place as well. It's about aiming for something bigger and better than what we're seeing many programs do today. And this is because feedback comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a crazy dog lady, and so I take any chance of sneaking pictures of dogs into my slides. But this kind of illustrates it quite well. There's solicited feedback from those requests like surveys. There's unsolicited feedback that is just given and not requested. It could be complaints, it could be social media posts. Structured feedback coming from those defined response sources like those quantitative metrics, star ratings. Unstructured feedback, like the open feedback sources, like open-ended comments. It could be customer emails, again, complaints data. Direct feedback, that's the feedback that's expressed, those direct perceptions coming from the customers from a variety of different sources. Surveys and social being a few that immediately come to mind. And then implied feedback, like customer behaviors that help reflect or contextualize their perceptions, like their purchase history and their call frequency. And then there's a wealth of different tools that can actually support this as well. And it's been a little blurry these days. I think that a lot of companies have many different tools and technologies, like I said, that they're not always using to the fullest. There's CFM and VOC tools, there's digital experience tools, there's contact center tools like speech analytics, which play a crucial role. And then there's insights and engagement communities, which have this strong ability to really go deep with the customer. And so with all these different types of feedback, it's really important that your customers are sharing, what's meaningful and relevant to them with you. And, all of this is important, especially right now. I feel like I'm probably going to drive that point home way too much today, because companies need to be more sensitive and not be tone deaf. This requires really evaluating how you're listening and exactly how you're going about this. For many organizations, there's been this long need to evolve and change and actually put your customer at the center. As I mentioned, it involves adjusting your approach, tapping into the wealth of other feedback and insights, all that information your customers are already giving you. And it means taking advantage of those sources that are already in place. So think about it this way. Your customers are already telling you a great amount of detail about the experience you deliver and what's really important to them. And the contact center, alone is a treasure trove of information. In fact, customer service is a key driver category for almost every single B2C industry that we study at Forrester. It goes beyond the calls, though. If you're using chat, and if your customers email you, if you have secure messaging features, all of these interactions play a critical role in the customer experience that you deliver. And your customers, they tend to be channel agnostic. They're gonna go about engaging with you in the ways that are convenient for them. So you have to have the ability to connect the dots across the organization. You have to be able to look at things broadly and narrowly. So for example, we've seen right now with the situation that we're in, a lot of companies going deeper with their insights and engagement communities versus the narrow approach that they were often taking with surveys. And they're working on building more of that bi-directional relationship with their customers. In fact, I wrote a blog post, when this situation first came out, and encourage people to take advantage of those tools and technologies that are in place. And if you have it, it's a great way to build a relationship internally with the team that might own that. And so by tapping into this wealth of information, I know I only gave a few examples of different sources across channels, across lines of business, you're really setting yourself up to get more of that cross-functional holistic view. That view that is really crucial to being able to move the needle on what matters, meet the needs of the customers, and be able to show that ROI. I talked about closing the feedback loop, and I wanted to double down on this a little bit more because unfortunately, I think this is an area that many companies have an opportunity to improve. It's not just enough to collect the feedback. You have to be able to put it to good use, and you have to be able to act on it. It can't fall into a black hole somewhere. You have to be able to show your customers that you're listening and that you're doing something about where you fall short. When I talked about how companies struggle with those different aspects of VOC, I would say that this is one of the top ones. They struggle to complete that cycle of 4 key activities continuously, but the feedback loop being one of the most critical. Closing the loop is not only good for your customers, but it's actually great for the business as well. But a lot of companies continue to forget this. You can close that feedback loop individually. You can close that feedback loop collectively. And it doesn't, like I said, you don't have to do it one-on-one. And you can doing it more broadly can be equally as impactful and beneficial. I often hear things, and I don't know if it's always a valid excuse. In some organizations, it definitely is. But we'll hear things like, oh, well, resources are an issue. But I think that this is often because there is not a perceived value coming from this activity. This is why it's critical to show the impact of everything that you're doing and showing the impact specifically of closing the loop. Did it recover the relationship with the customer? Did it write the experience? Did it contribute to them making ongoing purchases? Did it contribute to them actually referring you because you showed that you cared? So to do this and be able to essentially benchmark that experience before and after instituting the closed loop, you can really look at what was the experience like before closing the loop, and then look at the results of after. So this will allow you to identify whether or not closing the loop actually had an impact on your business, on experiences like decreasing the cost to serve customers, increasing that cross-sell and upsell potential? Did it actually reduce customer churn? Did it increase those referrals that I talked about? And what are the business processes that it improved? Did it have an impact on the employee as well? For example, this is still one of my favorites today, even though it dates back to 2008. It also does date back to another time of crises. Charles Schwab, they actually were looking to reestablish their connection with their customer. This is from an old Harvard Business Review article. They actually instituted a closed loop process, and they did so without some of the technologies that exist today that actually really make it easier. And as a result of doing this, reestablishing that relationship and showing their customers that they cared, they actually saw an increase in assets under management, as well as improved CX metrics, simply from closing the loop. So companies must also really connect that inner loop to that outer loop. Like I said, it's not just about fixing the one-on-one experience with the customers. You have to be able to look at the sum of all parts, so to speak, and attempt to tackle those larger scale systemic issues. So for example, when your contact center supervisors reach out to customers who are quite unhappy because they've identified a broken process, and that process remains broken until a CX team or VOC team analyzes and prioritizes those bigger issues, those challenges are going to keep coming in. And so you have to be able to tie things back to the internal systems, and that's going to mean doing more homework, investing more time, investing resources, and really looking to make that financial investment in being able to resolve these issues. So there's the short term, closing that one-on-one loop, and then there's the bigger systemic issue loop. And
so
that's
Faith,
something, oops, sorry.
Can I just ask you a question? No, I think the whole kind of topic of the closed loop is a big one, right? And I know you recently wrote a report, because this is an area that you and I have talked about before, and I know you're passionate about it. When it comes up to kind of those two dimensions of closing the loop, whether it's that short-term kind of ad hoc, doing it for a single customer, and the more encompassing kind of comprehensive approach of closing the loop as it relates to process issues or systemic issues, it would feel to me like certainly the former is easier, but the latter is probably more important. Like, do you have a sense as to where organizations are in general on those two kind of journeys?
Very reactive, and I don't think maturity is there with either. For example, this was, I'll use a personal experience, and I won't shame anybody, but I had received 4 surveys in one day from an organization through 2 different technologies, in addition to multiple calls to their contact center. So technically, I was a highly angry and engaged person at this point. Nobody ever circled back with me, and based on my knowledge of the costs of the technologies that they were being used, that was a huge mess. Even sending a simple email saying, we apologize, there was something going on, we're still investigating the issue, even trying to do something would have been extremely impactful. They did nothing. And this is a company that has continued to grow over the years and has evolved. In addition to that, I would say that based on a lot of the feedback that I've seen just in doing some additional research about this organization, as a result of this, they haven't taken their feedback to heart. So for example, one of the big things that seems to create a very bad experience for this organization is the reliance on a third-party partner for delivery. I think that this is something that might highlight a further gap in VOC programs about that B2B2C experience, so to speak, or that partner experience or that middleman experience. But I know, based on just a little bit of research, that thousands of people had a similar issue, but yet that policy hasn't changed. So it's not uncommon to see companies just very immature when it comes to both of those. And that's because, not only do they not have that formal closed loop process, even if it's focused on that small scale foundational service recovery, or they're not doing it at scale, it's also that they don't necessarily have a prioritization framework in place, which we'll talk a little bit about as we continue. But that is one of the biggest gaps that I see with VOC programs, is that one, if you're a siloed program, you're only going to be able to chase what's in your channel or in your line of business. You're not going to be able to make those bigger systemic improvements that are going to translate to that better experience. I think last year during our Forrester conference and another vendors conference that I had attended, I asked the question, how many of you have what you would deem an enterprise level prioritization framework? And let's just say the number of hands that went up, and this was multiple hundreds of people, was less than 5. Which was, I think that that's a highlight of a bigger issue, and it's informed a lot of my research plan for the rest of the year, because until you can move the needle on those one-on-one things and then actually connect the dots across the enterprise, I'm Italian and I talk with my hands a lot. You're throwing spaghetti to the wall and you're expecting it to stick. So it's a sign of the times. I think companies need to double down and focus on process and institute these processes, and it's not that easy.
Great. Okay. Thanks for the ad lib. Thank you.
Oh,
I'm going to let you resume with your next slide.
Oh, thank you. So, I did some research last year and I continue to dive into what are these best in class companies doing that is different than others. And it's been interesting to me because it doesn't necessarily mean that you often have to have this dedicated centralized team that owns CX. You just need that cross-functional collaboration. You need people who are willing to share and cooperate. But according to our data too, unfortunately here, another negative Nelly sort of comment coming out of me, 45% of CX pros actually cited that the biggest obstacle that stood in their way was this lack of collaboration internally. And sadly, this number has actually gotten worse over the past few years. So it's really crucial to build those relationships. If you're a CX team, work with your digital team, work with your contact center, build relationships with social. You don't need to own all these things. Set very clear expectations about what we do and what you do. And the sum of everybody coming together is going to be far more impactful than going about it in a siloed fashion. Enablement and empowerment of the front lines. Best in class companies, they do an effective job of really not only giving people the insights and information to deliver that better customer experience, they also, help develop the right processes. They help put the process in place. It's not just about one input. It could be even capturing that the frontline feedback or voice of the employee about ways that you can help them deliver their better experience and more effectively do their job. And these best-in-class companies are definitely being able to connect those dots between that customer experience and empowering and enable their people, especially those at the front lines, not just those at the front lines. Focusing on unstructured and unsolicited feedback and integrating to other forms of data. These were technically two separate things, but I pulled them together because they're so intermingled. You're sitting on this wealth of insights in your organization, those calls to the contact center. If you have chat, direct customer emails. If you're a sales-driven organization with, account managers, they're a wealth of insights and information about the experience you deliver. So being able to, one, connect the dots across systems, but also uncover things from agent notes, sales rep notes, POS systems, could be your HR systems, your CRM, and just really connecting the dots to get to that bigger picture of not just the what and the scores, but the why behind it. They don't data debate. This one, I think, is kind of the result of too many companies having too many different efforts taking place at the same time, and they often tell very different stories. And so having the bigger picture and the context around what's really happening reduces the amount of excuse making and debating that takes place. I'll use an example of a company that I was talking to recently, and she joked that what made her really successful was the fact that she actually stopped talking about what they were seeing with their smaller subset of survey data. And she was investing her time in building relationships with those cross-functional partners to develop a more single version of the truth, and that the power of thousands of feedback records from a variety of sources was far more impactful than the smaller number of survey responses. And that helped the CX team gain credibility, and it really helped them move the needle and get adoption across their enterprise. And then lastly, I talked about this, prioritization continues to be a challenge for so many companies, and that if you're not able to tap into doing the right things that move the needle and are most impactful to the customer, obviously across all the different channels, your customers see you as one brand. They don't care about how you're organized, but also the outcomes that are a result of it. I'll use, this is a financial services firm. They've got multiple efforts happening, and their digital team continues to design experiences in their own silo, and they're wondering why they're not moving the needle. Having had discussions with other folks within this organization, it's evident to me that they just don't share with each other. So they're not prioritizing effectively. So each of these parts of the business is doing a lot of great things. They're just not those things that would rise to the top if they prioritized at that top level. So, I mean, if you do these things, I think that that is where you have this greater opportunity to transform. Which brings me to my next point. You have to approach this strategically. And when you're approaching VOC programs strategically, you're going to be able to become that beautiful butterfly, so to speak. Companies that are improving CX, they're actually tackling those systemic improvements. They're doing that service recovery. They're embedding those formal processes. They're contributing to that creation of that customer-centric culture. Another benefit of investing in the VOC. So sharing those verbatims and stories, storytelling across the organization. And then, really, again, I can't drive this point home enough. It's about those outcomes, like reducing service costs, reducing overall cost per member, for example, increasing loyalty with your customers, reducing customer churn, increasing lifetime value. And one of the hidden things that I've often seen too is if a company is actually starting to invest in VOC and they're leveraging that employee feedback as a part of the program too, employee churn is another benefit that a lot of companies have seen. So by showing your employees that you actually care about the customer and that you're trying to help them deliver a great experience and infusing their insights and information about the roles that they play, it's a huge opportunity as well. Another thing that you have to do is really, I think, focus on communication. You have to communicate those benefits of VOC, the benefits of closing the loop like I talked about, and help them see CX as a value to your business. I noted that this can be a struggle, but Rome wasn't built in a day. It just simply takes time to really help people see the work that's being done. And that means, it's not just about, sending out a dashboard. It's about sharing those wins, big and small. It means, again, telling that story. So I'm going to tie this back to closing the loop again, since I feel like that's a point that we're really trying to drive home today, is, if you can help your your internal stakeholders and internal customers clarify that business value of this again, it's going to be really impactful. For example, some companies, they'll spend money giving customers a credit rather than actually fixing the problem itself. So this was a US-based retailer. They actually showed that an apology alone meant more to their customers than a monetary resolution, like the refund. And so that apology alone resulted in a 7-point increase in their customer retention, and while the monetary solution only resulted in a 4. That was interesting because what it was able to do was go have discussions with leaders that had a completely different viewpoint and start to show the value of CX. So these types of actions can really change the perception of customer experience in VOC. And really help people stop perceiving CX as a nice to have and view it as a must have that it really is. So next, what do you need to do to actually get charted on your path to greatness? Well, whether you're new to this or whether you're looking to mature your capabilities, you have to be willing to adjust. You have to be honest with yourself and say what is and isn't working. And you have to be able to start to fill those gaps. This also requires not being afraid to innovate. And the animations for some reason are not showing up. Okay, sorry. You have to be able to innovate your approach. Don't be afraid to test and learn new things. So for example, we're seeing more companies start to infuse image and video feedback as a part of their VOC program as a great way to inspire their employees and help them develop a connection. And then lastly, you really have to constantly reassess and plan for your future. Programs are changing fast, your customer needs are changing fast, so you can't just let your program stagnate. So if you do these 3 things continuously, in addition to completing that cycle of 4 key activities and connect those data dots across your organization, I have no doubt that you're going to achieve success. But I do want to reiterate, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of passion, which is, I know you're all here today because you have that. So don't be afraid to maximize what's next coming out of this.
And it also takes buy-in from all levels in the organization, doesn't it, Faith? In terms of making sure that this is a priority in the the C-level office.
Well, absolutely. And I think part of the problem there is that, that a lot of people still perceive CX as fluff because they're not having enough of that, the money discussion, so to speak, and that impact discussion, or CX teams and VOC teams, insights teams, you name it. They don't necessarily always connect the dots to those KPIs that the enterprise might be chasing. And so, you have to, sometimes the story that gets told, it's dependent upon the stakeholder. You have to really be able to connect it to what's important to them and not develop your approach in a vacuum, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. It's, we really enjoy working with you and with Forrester. You guys are definitely ahead of the curve in terms of understanding kind of the breadth of the customer experience space, and that it, while it includes technology, certainly goes beyond just technology. So in the next section, I just want to spend a few minutes introducing some of the philosophies from a Vision Critical standpoint, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A. So in terms of where Vision Critical kind of views the opportunity in the market, we really like to talk about the power of continuous feedback. And that is something that we believe is unleashed when you're able to combine the broad feedback that you would collect from surveys or social intent data or call center data or whatever it might be, but it's the combination of that with deeper insights. And in our case, we provide a lot of the capabilities for both the broad feedback and the deep insights. But when I speak about deep insights in our case, I mean specifically this notion of these digital insight communities. So let's start with a customer example. Toyota is an organization that we've worked with in particular in Europe, and their customer insights program is called Consumer One. And this group is chartered with understanding the whole customer journey around vehicle purchases. And the part of the story that I want to share today is that they were really focused on specifically that vehicle handover step in the process, the day you go to the dealership to pick up your car. And what was really interesting about how Toyota approached this is that they had a lot of these broad feedback sort of mechanisms, right, to understand at the top level where they stood from a CX or a VOC perspective. But what they were lacking was the ability to dig into some of the discoveries that they were making from that broad feedback with deeper insights. And so we partnered with Toyota to help them develop a digital insight community. And it was really interesting because they found a couple of things. One was the idea that a lot of these long-held assumptions within the Toyota team were actually false. So, as an example, they felt like customers, when they're driving away with their brand new car, are like on top of the world and super excited. As a matter of fact, they found that a large segment of their customers were super anxious driving off of that dealership lot. And so they were able to use their digital insight communities to dig into why was that? Why are they not feeling, why are they not leaving happy? Why are they leaving anxious? And they were finding things like, the manuals and the multimedia information that was provided to customers throughout that process in getting to understand and know the new bells and whistles on their car were lacking a little bit. There was an opportunity to improve that. And there was also an opportunity to improve just the staff that they were dealing with at the dealership on the day of their vehicle pickup. So they introduced a few new ideas, which they also tested through their digital insight community, and were able to do things like having a dedicated spot at the dealership for vehicle handover, so that when buyers were showing up, they weren't getting sucked into the sales show floor, but they were in a dedicated space and kind of getting that white glove treatment. The second was that they added actually a role within their team to have a person that was not a salesperson, not a service manager, but somebody that was specifically dedicated to people kind of picking up their vehicles, to take them through all the features in the vehicle, and making sure that they were comfortable before they drove off the lot. So those are the kinds of examples of being able to kind of tie that deeper insight into some of the things that they were hearing from their broader feedback mechanisms. And for Toyota, this really resulted in improved customer experience and voice of the customer overall. They were able to get really deep and profiled insights into their customers, whether it was based on gender or age or location, and really to understand how customer preferences change depending on those demographics. And most exciting for me was the idea that once they had this digital insight community in place, they were able to field studies and questions and get responses back from their customers in 24 hours. So when we think about the age in which we currently find ourselves, the ability to get those responses really quickly and in less than 24 hours is super powerful, because not only can you go get that initial answer, but you can keep asking and compare the results from one day to the next or 1 week to the next as our global situation changes on an hourly basis, it seems these days. So to get a little bit more into the vision critical vision, no pun intended or pun intended, when we look at the whole insight and feedback space, we think about kind of our clients, customers, universes, right? And the broad yellow circle that you hear really represents that total universe of customers that an organization might have. These are the people that might research products, they might buy products and solutions or services and consume those products, but they don't do much else. They're really focused on just kind of the buying process and the usage process. But within that community, there's a subset of folks who are more engaged with the brand for a number of reasons. Maybe they're advocates, maybe they're influencers, maybe they just have a higher affinity to the brand. And so we call these folks the I care segment. So when we think about the way to get insights from these different kinds of customer segments, whether it's the I buy segment or the I care segment, there's a lot of different options out there in the market, right? And again, you see kind of how this ties back to this notion that I've been talking about of broad feedback and deep insights. In the I buy segment, there's a number of mechanisms or sources of feedback, whether it's surveys or online reviews or scraping social sentiment data or call center data and being able to integrate all of that for an aggregate view of your overall kind of customer pulse. These are appropriate for using with millions of customers, but they tend to give a fairly kind of narrow or shallow sense of what's really going on. Whereas in the deep insight side of things, there's a number, oops, sorry, that was too soon. There's a number of sources of feedback that are traditionally used, whether it's customer interviews or focus groups or advisory boards. And the reality right now is that the challenge with those methods is that they heavily rely on face-to-face interactions. They're expensive and they take a lot of time. The difference with the digital insight community approach here is that it is something that you can stand up fairly quickly. And once you have it on, it's kind of an always on sort of mechanism where you can always reach your community or your member base to solicit their feedback or input. So, in terms of the opportunity for combining broad feedbacks with deep insights, there's a number of use cases. In the broad feedback area, obviously there's kind of the VOC programs. VOE is becoming increasingly important. NPS continues to be a key measurement in many organizations, and just the overall optimization of the customer journey, right? Whereas in the deep insights area, we talk about some slightly more targeted use cases. So we have a number of clients, for example, using insight communities to help research messaging and advertising strategies, and to be able to segment, how certain marketing messages are resonating or not with specific segments of their audience. On the product and UX front, we have, in particular in tech and financial services, but across multiple industries, customers that are using insight communities to during the product development process to test and validate product features. On the user experience design side, this has proven to be supremely valuable in helping our clients who are developing products to inform their product development decisions and priorities with actual customer and user feedback. And then the last piece here you see is kind of the same as we see on the yellow side, right? The whole area around customer experience and VOC and VOE. And this really speaks to that Toyota example, being able to do, why analysis or root cause analysis on some of the things that we might be seeing in the broad feedback results, so that we can really get more deeply entrenched into the underlying factors that are leading to what that data is telling us. So there's a lot of different use cases for the combination of broad feedback and deep insights, but as Faith was saying earlier, we also believe, and we've adopted kind of framework that we call LIAM here internally, when you have the L, I, A, and the M, that it has to be a continuous loop, right? So I think a lot of organizations have started listening. They might be starting to get their feet wet on the interpret piece. As we were discussing earlier, the segment here where we're talking about acting on what those insights are telling you, I think is an evolving space and a huge opportunity for a lot of organizations. And then the monitor piece, right? It has to be this continuous thing, because customer sentiments, customer preferences, customer attitudes are changing, especially right now, perhaps even on an hourly basis, and being able to kind of keep that loop going to monitor how that changes over time is supremely important. So one of the things that I wanted to share today were actually some insights from our own customer community, and we have a couple of different things to share here. So it's been really interesting to see how our clients are using their insight mechanisms over the last few weeks and months. And one of the interesting observations that I wanted to share with everybody today was this idea that in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, customers actually want to engage with that kind of insight process now more than ever. So a couple of examples to share with you here today are, a few of our clients actually reached out to their insight communities to ask them straight out, do you want to hear from us right now, or do you want us to leave you alone? And it was really interesting to see that in gaming and grocery segments, the responses that our clients saw was astronomical, right? So in gaming, for example, 97% of the folks that are in that community said, no, keep coming at me with invitations to provide feedback. This is something that I want to keep doing right now. Very similar in the grocery segment. I think healthcare is near and dear to all of our hearts right now, understanding that, the challenges that the people that we know and love that work in this industry are facing every day. But one of our healthcare clients in the US, who had been running insight activities on a number of different topics, actually fielded an activity specific to COVID-19. And they saw such an overwhelming response to that survey, and the highest engagement activity of any of those different insight programs that they'd run. So that was good to see that people are interested in kind of sharing their thoughts and their feelings right now, which is great. Another piece to share with you all today is from a recent study that we wrapped up through our own virtual advisory board. We call it our Spark Next community, where we drink our own champagne, so to speak, and our clients are wonderful in providing feedback on the things that they're thinking and feeling and seeing within their own businesses and industries. And we recently ran a study on specifically the topic of crisis preparedness and crisis management. And a couple of the nuggets that came out of that April study to share were, first of all, that a large portion of the customers, I should say the clients, the vision critical clients that participated, indicated that customer insights have a key role in helping to improve and inform their organization's crisis preparedness strategy. So I think that's really great to see that organizations aren't just looking internally, they're also looking externally to understand all of the different factors that are at play right now. The second interesting tidbit was as it relates to response rates. And when we're thinking about some of those deep insight feedback mechanisms, like an insight community, it was really exciting for me personally to see that our clients are seeing actually much higher response rates within those deep feedback sorts of deep insight sort of mechanisms, like their digital insight community, than they are seeing through other methods, right? And I think this is indicative of the fact that it's a higher engagement level and people are just more likely to want to participate and respond. So in terms of some of the key areas that we focus on and where we believe the power of continuous feedback really lies, I would just kind of start by summarizing and saying that there are 4 key areas. One is for organizations that want to undergo like a complete customer-centric transformation, who want to infuse the customer in everything that happens within their enterprise, whether it's the accounts payable department, the product development area, the marketing team, or the sales team. And we have a number of clients that have been getting onto the journey of being able to use customer insights throughout their entire organization to de-risk decisions. The second area is as it relates to boosting the effectiveness of marketing and advertising, being able to test those marketing messages or segment markets and to better target your audiences. A number of companies doing some really exciting stuff here. Third is the whole kind of product innovation and co-creation space, which I spoke about a little bit a couple slides ago. But this is really helping to inform the product development process so as to improve the actual product that's being delivered, but also accelerate the time to market and drive higher sales. And then last but not least is the whole area around customer experience and having that kind of customer journey optimization focus, being able to diagnose those moments in the journey that are sources of dissatisfaction and really addressing those, whether, as we were talking about with Faith on the topic of closed loop, whether those are kind of one-to-one ad hoc sorts of things that need to be addressed or more systemic and procedural things that need to be addressed within the organization. So overall, I think this is a really fascinating time and space for kind of looking at how customer insights and feedback can be applied to help improve an organization's profitability and business. Those are all important, but at the end of the day, improving how organizations are delivering products and services to their customers and delivering value to their customers. So with that, I wanted to say thank you, and my contact information is in here, but we'll shift over to our Q&A portion of the agenda. And I know that we have a few questions already coming in the queue. So Faith, some of these, well, most of these seem to be for you, which is the point and which is great. So I hope you're ready. You're back on the hot seat.
I am happy to help in any way that I can.
So going back to earlier on in your presentation, when I think you talked about the 6 aspects of customer experience, there was an individual who was interested to have you elaborate a little bit on the enablement piece of that pie. And what are some of the activities that organizations are doing there specifically?
Yeah, that one's a tough one because it really depends on like your entire CX ecosystem, so to speak. So for example, there's oftentimes cumbersome processes that get in the way. They could, not only slow those customer interactions down, but ultimately lead to a messy or broken experience. There's, like sometimes it could be systems related, depending on the tools, the things that are actually required to serve your customers. So it's really important to look across your entire ecosystem, not just that customer journey, and then just dive deeper into the subset of what's actually, I guess, hindering your employees from delivering an experience. So it could be you start with that, and then you want to be able to create processes that actually will help connect the dots, improve collaboration, for example. So it could be something as simple as defining roles and responsibilities to remove any of the gray area. That's something we've seen a lot of companies do. It could be empowering managers to help remove some of the roadblocks that exist that deliver a good experience. So for example, like this could be centered more on like a frontline manager. This was a large global telco, and what they ended up doing was they had uncovered that some of the processes that they had just actually created a bad EX. And didn't really make their employees feel valued for the work that they were doing because things had to be escalated to a certain level. So they quickly removed that policy. They made an update, and what was interesting is, again, they had their own hypotheses of what would happen, and it was debunked because they realized that the amount of credits being given by letting everybody have this capability because of the process and policy change, it actually led to less being paid out in credits. It could be sometimes removing some of the more clunky systems that exist. I do a lot with healthcare and financial service organizations in particular, and sometimes legacy systems are the reason that that things are not going that well. And so sometimes it's building that phased approach, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, about how you're going to remove some of these barriers that stand in the way. But a lot of it's, there's a people and process aspect of it as well as technology. And so it really depends on the constraints of your own environment. And so if you started with that customer journey and ecosystem map, that would help you uncover more. But I'm more than happy to email after this and share some additional insights. I know that we're starting to run out of time, so I just try to give you a truncated answer.
That's great. Thank you. I was intrigued by your mention of kind of employee experience or voice of employee as an enabler of the enablement, right? Like, and that's an interesting thought, to think that as an organization is looking at those enablement activities, being able to use some of these tools to gather the employee feedback is going to be really important too, because there's probably a lot to discover there.
Yep, absolutely. So there's a number of companies now. There's two different aspects of this, and I think with this focus on EX, what we've been seeing is some confusion around. There's VOE in the traditional sense, that's about that employee experience, and then there's that voice of the customer through the employee, which is that the employee telling you why they weren't able to deliver that great experience. So one of my former colleagues actually in a report wrote about your employees being able to be a canary in a coal mine. And essentially alert you to those bigger signs of danger before they become an even bigger issue. And I think that there's just this huge missed opportunity in VOC programs to tap into the power of especially that frontline feedback or find additional use cases. So for example, this was a drug company. They realized that their sales reps are just this great source of information. And so they were trying to find a way without making it too difficult or cumbersome for them to be able to share, what happened in the interactions with the clinic managers and the doctors. And so what they started to do was capture like video feedback from those employees. And they were able to gain a lot of context that they weren't getting in their CRM typed after a call, because it was much easier. So by simply doing that, they enabled their people to share more insights that really translated to the customer experience. Now, granted, they uncovered some things that, maybe were a little bit more on the employee side. They had to partner with their HR team, but there's a wealth of opportunity in connecting the dots between those two things.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. So another question is, do you have a point of view in terms of the advent of kind of open data initiatives as it relates to all these different data sources?
I will admit that is not technically like within my wheelhouse, but I can speak to what I've been seeing from a CFM VOC technologies, because that's the space that I cover within the CX arena. And there's, some vendors might disagree with me here, but there is no jack of all trades in many ways right now. And, different stakeholders often have different needs. And so tools and technologies do need to play nice with one another, especially if you want to truly maximize the potential of a truly enterprise program. So for example, I was working with a company recently who loves their vendor. They have a great relationship, but there's just some gaps. And so that's forced them to actually bring in another technology to play nice with this technology to really allow them to go deeper in terms of, their text analytics in particular. And so it's, I think it's about looking at the tools and systems you have, evaluating the relationship that you have with the vendor, trying to maximize the value through the features and capabilities. The space has been changing so much, and there's vendors who have features that users aren't even aware of, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity in determining what your current vendors can do for you, but not being afraid to go elsewhere. So I think it's important for tools to be open and work with each other. In order to achieve that success, I think it's really necessary.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So in your presentation, you kind of talked about the different kinds of feedback, and you mentioned direct and indirect and inferred and that whole kind of thread of conversation. Are you seeing any trends that are kind of popping out to you in terms of whether one or more of those sources of feedback is going to become more important, or is it more of a situation where all of them have to be taken kind of as some of the parts, so to speak?
Yeah. So there is some variability there. It depends on your brand, your approach, the relationship you have with your customers. So for example, a number of companies that already had a strong relationship with their customer, they're not really seeing they're seeing a drop in response rates, but they're also not surveying the same way that they were pre-COVID. They've adjusted their approach. And so for those organizations, even though they're survey driven in many cases, they're starting to add other sources because feedback fatigue is a real thing. People are being inundated for feedback at a variety of points in their customer experience. So It's about more of that bigger picture view. I talked about the contact center being a treasure trove of information. Your contact center doesn't want to be viewed as a cost center. I actually have a report coming out on this, I believe, tomorrow. You can maximize the capabilities of different stakeholders if you help shift some of the responsibility, and that stems from that bigger picture. But I think there's some variability in terms of the best way to go there, but it is about that bigger picture first, and then assessing. That's why I keep trying to drive that point home about assessing like the value coming out of your data sources. Are you able to extract insights from whether it be survey or whether it be survey connected to digital? And kind of piggybacking off there, I feel like I'm derailing because this one's easy to go down a rabbit hole. We're seeing a lot of organizations too say, survey is, we're trying to be strategic about survey. So we're only using survey to ask the business questions we don't already have the answers to, or to validate things that we might be seeing, in an insights and engagement community with people who aren't a part of our community. And so it's, I think there's a lot of testing and learning happening. But it starts with testing the validity of the sources that you're collecting. So for example, one company that I was recently chatting with realized that how they were going about their relationship study wasn't really delivering them much in terms of insights. So that allowed them to go back and work with their professional services provider to reevaluate their approach. And so they adjusted that study, completely changed it up, and then added a few additional touch points and other data sources. And they've been, so far so good. They've said that they've been able to get to a deeper level of actionability than ever before. And it wasn't just the survey-driven program that they had in the past. So I would say there's some variability, and I'd be happy to engage with whoever asked that question to go a little bit deeper in the specific context of their organization.
Okay, thank you. That's generous of you. Thank you. So we are going to just kind of move into wrapping up the session. As mentioned at the top of the call, but I'll mention it again now, the recording will be shared with everybody that registered for the event, and it'll also be on the Vision Critical website. We also wanted to mention that everybody that registered for the event is going to get Faith's report, which is entitled "The Top 5 Best Practices of Closing the Customer Feedback Loop," because you've certainly heard us talking about that today. And, I'm always happy to end things early. So Faith, I wanted to thank you again for your time. And it's always good to see you. And hopefully we'll see each other in person sometime soon.
Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate being here with the team today. And I hope that the audience saw value in hanging out with us.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Wishing you a great and healthy and sunny day wherever you are. Take care.